Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lights, getting under a blanket and taking a nice slow drift into one of history's least romantic corners. Forget roses, forget candlelit dinners. We're talking about royal marriages in medieval Europe. And if you're already imagining some fairy tale scene with flowing gowns and courtly love, lower your expectations. By a lot. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were about land, money, power, and sometimes just about not getting stabbed by your neighbor. And of course, when you throw in a few centuries of dynastic inbreeding, a dash of bad luck, and the general misery of medieval medicine, you end up with some marriages that can only be described as cursed. So tonight let's float through a series of unfortunate unions. We'll meet kings and queens who hated each other on sight, royal couples who managed to stay married while plotting one another's murder, and dynasties that basically collapsed under the weight of their own questionable genetics. And don't worry, I'll keep the pace nice and gentle, so if you drift off halfway through the saga of some tragic French princess, that's totally fine. All right, let's slip into our first marital nightmare, Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII of France. Now, Eleanor of Aquitaine was a powerhouse. One of the richest heiresses in Europe, she had lands that basically covered half of modern-day France. When she married Louis VII, King of France, in 1137, it looked like a perfect dynastic match. France got money and territory. Eleanor got a crown. Everybody wins, except they couldn't have been more mismatched if they'd tried. Louis was deeply religious, almost monk-like, and let's be honest, not exactly brimming with charisma. Eleanor, on the other hand, was glamorous, bold, and had the personality of someone who wanted to run the show. Imagine pairing a hyperactive socialite with a guy who thinks the highlight of the week is a quiet prayer service. They had 2 daughters, which in medieval dynastic math basically equaled 0, because what they needed was a son. Louis kept dragging Eleanor on pilgrimages, crusades, and long church visits, which wasn't exactly her vibe. On the Second Crusade, she allegedly started openly flirting with her uncle Raymond of Antioch. Louis wasn't thrilled, obviously. By 1152, the Pope himself was called in to try to fix the marriage. That tells you everything. But even the Pope couldn't glue this one together. The marriage was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, which is just medieval legal jargon for you're technically cousins, so let's pretend that's the problem. 2 months later, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. She didn't waste time. Louis must have been fuming. That's like breaking up and then immediately posting Instagram stories with your hotter, younger new boyfriend. So yeah, cursed marriage number 1. 2 powerful people stuck in a union that made them both miserable, ended by the Pope, and ultimately split France and England into rival camps for generations. Great job, everyone. Isabella of France and Edward II of England, next. Let's float over to another royal train wreck, Isabella of France and Edward II of England. Isabella was called the she-wolf of France, and honestly, fair enough. She grew into the role. But at the start, she was just a 12-year-old French princess shipped off to marry Edward in 1308. Now, Edward II wasn't exactly husband of the year material. He was more interested in his male favorites than in his wife. His closest companion was Piers Gaveston, a nobleman who Edward showered with gifts, titles, and what historians like to delicately call unusual affection. When Edward married Isabella, he allegedly gave her wedding jewelry to Gaveston. Romantic. The English nobles hated Gaveston. Isabella felt sidelined, and Edward seemed determined to make everyone resent him. Eventually, the barons captured and executed Gaveston, which Edward never really forgave them for. But did he learn to treat his wife better? Nope. He just found new favorites. Isabella, meanwhile, started plotting. She bided her time. had a few kids with Edward, and then during a diplomatic mission to France, she simply didn't come back. Instead, she hooked up with Roger Mortimer, an English exile. Together they raised an army, invaded England, captured Edward, and forced him to abdicate in favor of their teenage son, Edward III. As for Edward II himself, well, his end is one of those historical mysteries. Officially, he died in 1327, probably murdered while in captivity. The lurid story about a red-hot poker is probably just propaganda. But let's just say this was not a peaceful retirement, so yeah, cursed marriage material, a neglected wife, a distracted husband, political chaos, invasion, and a possible gruesome murder. Definitely not one to put on a Hallmark card. Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI of England. While we're already in England, let's dim the lights even more for Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI. Henry VI was not, how do I put this gently, built for kingship. He was shy, pious, indecisive, and prone to mental breakdowns. Not great qualities if you're supposed to rule during one of the most violent periods of English history. He married Margaret of Anjou in 1445. She was strong-willed, politically savvy, and, unfortunately for Henry, determined to actually govern. When Henry had a complete mental collapse in 1453, becoming effectively catatonic for more than a year, Margaret stepped up. But instead of thanking her, the nobility hated it. To make matters worse, their only son, Edward of Westminster, was allegedly so violent and unhinged that even other medieval royals thought he was a bit much. Which is saying something. One chronicler claimed that Edward delighted in talking about chopping off heads. Family dinners must have been a blast. Their marriage was basically a balancing act of Henry retreating into prayer, Margaret fighting everyone else, and their son terrorizing the court. And of course all this spiraled into the Wars of the Roses, one of the bloodiest civil wars in English history. So yes, definitely cursed. A mentally ill king, a fiercely unpopular queen, and a son who seemed like he was auditioning for a medieval slasher movie. Sleep well, everyone. Joanna the Mad and Philip the Handsome. Now let's gently float over to Spain for one of my personal favorite disasters. Joanna of Castile and Philip the Handsome, Joanna, later nicknamed the Mad, was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, yes, the same power couple who sponsored Columbus. Joanna was married off to Philip of Burgundy in 1496. He was called the Handsome, but if you've ever seen Habsburg portraits, you know beauty standards were generous. Let's just say he looked like someone had carved a jawline out of marzipan and then let it melt in the sun. At first, Joanna was completely smitten with him. Unfortunately, Philip wasn't exactly loyal. He had mistresses everywhere and didn't bother to hide it. Joanna, however, was fiercely jealous. Their marriage quickly turned into a cycle of passion, infidelity, and dramatic meltdowns. The stories about Joanna's behavior after Philip's sudden death in 1506 are legendary. Supposedly, she refused to let his body be buried, traveled with his coffin for months, and even opened the casket to kiss him. Whether that's entirely true or just court gossip exaggerated over time, it cemented her reputation as mad. What's certain is that her father and later her son, Charles V, kept her locked away for most of her life, using her supposed insanity as a convenient excuse to rule in her place. So cursed marriage indeed. A union that started in passion, devolved into betrayal, and ended with Joanna locked away for nearly 50 years. And that's just the beginning. Already we've seen marriages ending in annulments, coups, wars, and lifetime imprisonment. And don't worry. Medieval Europe has plenty more where that came from. In the next stretch, we'll wander into even darker corners. Queens accused of witchcraft, kings married to children, and unions so cursed that even the Pope probably sighed and said, "Good luck with that one." The most cursed marriages in medieval Europe, all right. We've already drifted past Eleanor and Louis, Isabella and Edward, Margaret and Henry, and of course poor Joanna and her not-so-handsome Philip. Let's just slide a little deeper under the covers and keep wandering through the candlelit corridors of Europe's most dysfunctional dynasties. Next up, one of the most unstable kings to ever sit on the French throne. Spoiler, his marriage didn't go much better than his reign. Charles VI of France and Isabeau of Bavaria. Charles VI of France is sometimes called Charles the Mad, and for once medieval nicknames were accurate. His reign from 1380 to 1422 was a mess of paranoia, breakdowns and hallucinations. So of course the people handling his marriage prospects thought, yes, let's bring in a teenager from Bavaria and see if that helps. Enter Isabeau of Bavaria. She was about 15 when she married Charles in 1385. He was only 17. At first things looked promising. They had a big, glittering wedding in Amiens, complete with feasts and tournaments. The French court was hopeful, and then the madness began. In 1392, Charles had a sudden mental collapse. He was riding through the forest with his knights when he suddenly turned on them, attacked his companions and killed several before being restrained. After that, he suffered periodic psychotic episodes, believing he was made of glass, refusing to let people touch him, forgetting his own name, and sometimes running wildly through the palace corridors. Meanwhile, poor Isabeau was left trying to keep the royal family afloat. She gave birth to 12 children, only 7 of whom survived infancy, which was considered a decent batting average at the time. But as Charles deteriorated, Isabeau gained influence, which naturally led to court factions accusing her of corruption, extravagance, and even witchcraft. And then there were the rumors about her love life. Chroniclers accused her of affairs, including one with her brother-in-law, the Duke of Orléans. Were the rumors true? Hard to say, but it gave enemies plenty of ammo to brand her as an adulteress. The ultimate cursed cherry on this already disastrous cake came in 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes. With Charles mentally gone, Isabeau was pressured into signing away the French crown to Henry V of England, effectively disinheriting her own son, the future Charles VII. Not exactly a glowing review of her marital career. So yes, cursed. A king who thought he was made of glass, a queen accused of witchcraft, and a country on the brink of collapse. Sweet dreams. Anne of Brittany and her 2 French kings. Let's just float over to another French queen with a cursed love life, Anne of Brittany. Anne was born in 1477, Duchess of the wealthy and semi-independent region of Brittany. Naturally, everyone wanted to marry her. She was basically the medieval equivalent of a walking pile of land deeds. Her first marriage was to Charles VIII of France in 1491. He was short, awkward, and reportedly not the brightest candle in the chandelier. But hey, he was King of France, so Anne didn't get much say. They married, and Charles promised that if he died first, she'd marry his successor, just to make sure Brittany stayed tied to France. Unfortunately, Charles wasn't destined for a long life. In 1498, he banged his head on a low doorway while hurrying to watch a tennis match and died instantly. Yes, the King of France basically lost a game of medieval tag with a door frame. True to the contract, Anne then married his cousin and successor, Louis XV. By all accounts, Louis was more charming than Charles, but also plagued with health issues. Their marriage was child-focused, and desperately tried to produce an heir who could keep Brittany semi-independent, while Louis wanted a boy to secure the French throne. They ended up with 2 daughters. No sons. Anne spent much of her life pregnant or mourning pregnancies. By the time she died at age 37, she had gone through at least 14 pregnancies, with most ending in miscarriage or stillbirth. It's a bleak reminder that royal women weren't just political pawns, but also human beings caught in an endless cycle of childbirth. So Anne's marriages, cursed twice over, one husband killed by a doorframe, the other desperate for heirs, and Anne herself worn out by pregnancies that never delivered the dynastic miracle she hoped for. Mary Tudor and Philip II of Spain now. Let's drift over to England again for a marriage so bleak it almost feels like a bad soap opera. Mary Tudor, better known as Bloody Mary, was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. By the time she took the throne in 1553, she was in her late 30s, unmarried, and desperate to restore Catholicism in England. Her advisors arranged a marriage to Philip of Spain, heir to the Habsburg Empire. Philip was younger, handsome-ish in that classic Habsburg way, meaning he looked like a jawbone experiment gone wrong, and deeply Catholic. For Mary, this seemed like the perfect match. The English people, however, hated it. They didn't want to be ruled by a Spaniard, and they definitely didn't want to risk England becoming just another Spanish province. The marriage contract had to include special clauses limiting Philip's power in England, which was not exactly a romantic prenup. When Philip finally arrived in 1554, he wasn't thrilled either. Mary was 5 years older, considered unattractive by contemporary standards, and, most importantly for him, she wasn't a great dynastic investment unless she could produce heirs. Mary thought she was pregnant twice. Both times turned out to be false. Modern historians suggest she may have suffered from phantom pregnancies, possibly due to a tumor or severe gynecological issues. Imagine the humiliation. The court prepared for royal births only to realize there was no baby. Philip predictably lost interest. He spent most of his time abroad, leaving Mary increasingly isolated and unpopular at home. She died childless in 1558, heartbroken, with England slipping toward Protestantism once again. So yes, a cursed marriage if there ever was one, a lonely queen, a disinterested husband, phantom pregnancies, and a legacy that went down in history as one of England's grimmest reigns. Christina of Denmark and Henry VIII, almost. Now, technically this one isn't a marriage, but it deserves a mention because of how spectacularly cursed it could have been. After Henry VIII executed his second wife, Anne Boleyn, in 1536, he went shopping for another bride. His eye landed on Christina of Denmark, a teenage widow who was considered both beautiful and politically useful. When Henry sent his envoys to propose, Christina supposedly delivered one of the coldest rejections in history. She reportedly said, "If I had two heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal." Translation, "I like my head attached to my shoulders. Thanks. Smart move." Christina dodged what would have been a marriage straight into the Tudor meat grinder. Considering Henry went on to cycle through 4 more wives, with varying degrees of disaster, it's safe to say this would have been cursed from the start. Recap driftso by now we've floated through glass kings, child bride queens, phantom pregnancies, and one king who literally lost a fight with a door. If you're still awake, congratulations. You're tougher than most medieval dynasties, but don't close your eyes yet. We still have plenty of cursed unions waiting in the shadows, couples who barely tolerated each other, kings who married children because apparently no one thought that was weird, and dynasties where inbreeding made the wedding vows sound more like a family reunion roll call. The most cursed marriages in medieval Europe, all right. We've already wandered through some bleak halls of matrimony in parts 1 and 2. We've seen kings who thought they were made of glass, queens who were basically left holding the political bag, phantom pregnancies, husbands distracted by favorites, and the occasional monarch who managed to die in a slapstick accident involving a door frame. If you're still with me, still half awake, congratulations. You've outlasted at least half of medieval Europe's royal couples. But don't worry, there are still plenty of cursed unions left to drift through tonight. Some end in flames, some in funerals, and some in dynastic catastrophes so confusing that the family tree looks like someone scribbled on parchment after too much mead. So, let's stretch out, get comfortable, and float into a slower, fuller look at a few more of these disasters. Peter III of Aragon and Constance of Sicily. Let's start in the Mediterranean, because nothing says cursed romance like the Pope personally hating your marriage. Peter III of Aragon married Constance of Sicily in 1262. On the surface, this was one of those marriages that medieval diplomats loved. It united two crowns, Aragon, which controlled much of northeastern Spain, and Sicily, which was a jewel in the middle of the Mediterranean. Constance herself had a legitimate claim to the Sicilian throne, which was very convenient for Peter. But here's the problem. The Pope already had his eye on Sicily, and popes did not like being told that their plans were ruined by some Spanish guy marrying the wrong heiress. Almost immediately, Peter's marriage turned him into enemy number one in Rome. The marriage basically guaranteed decades of conflict known as the War of the Sicilian Vespers. Imagine getting married, and instead of a honeymoon you get excommunication papers. Constance didn't exactly have a carefree married life. She gave birth to 6 children, raised them mostly alone while Peter was busy getting excommunicated, and lived under constant rumors that her husband was an overreaching tyrant. If you're picturing romantic evenings on the Sicilian coast, think again. Their union was more like being tied together while dodging papal lightning bolts. And that's the fun of medieval marriages. Even if the couple wasn't personally miserable, the politics usually cursed the whole thing. Charles II of Navarre and Joan of France now. Let's drift up toward Navarre, where the nickname alone should have been a red flag. Charles II of Navarre was called Charles the Bad, that's it. That was the branding. Not Charles the Bold or Charles the Brave, just the Bad. And that's who Joan of France married in 1352. Poor girl, Joan was the daughter of King John II of France, so her marriage to Charles should have sealed a nice alliance between France and Navarre. Instead, Charles spent most of his life betraying his French in-laws. One year he was scheming with England during the 100 Years' War. The next year he was pretending to be loyal, and the next year he was stabbing France in the back again. Joan, meanwhile, had the thankless role of royal wife who exists while her husband does terrible things. She gave him 7 children, tried to act as a stabilizing influence, and probably spent half her life apologizing at French family reunions. The cherry on this cursed cake is how Charles died. The story, which is probably exaggerated but too good not to repeat, says that in 1387 he was being treated for illness by being wrapped in a cloth soaked in brandy. A servant came in with a candle, tripped and set him on fire. He supposedly burned alive in his sheets. Was that exactly how it happened? Maybe not. But it's exactly the kind of chaotic exit you'd expect from someone nicknamed the Bad. For Joan, that meant she spent decades trapped in a marriage with one of Europe's least likable kings, only to watch him go out in a literal blaze. Cursed from start to finish, Richard II of England and Anne of Bohemia. Now let's float softly over to England, where Richard II decided to marry Anne of Bohemia in 1382. Richard was about 15 at the time, newly crowned, and Anne was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor. It sounded impressive, except politically it was a dud. She brought no dowry, no land, and very few allies. The English were unimpressed. Chroniclers muttered that the king had married for nothing. But here's the twist. Richard actually loved her. And that might be the most cursed thing of all, because love in a medieval royal marriage was basically useless. Love didn't stop rebellions. Love didn't pay for wars. And love definitely didn't provide heirs if the couple had no children. Richard and Anne's marriage was childless. For 12 years they lived together, apparently happily enough, but without producing the one thing everyone expected: a baby. Then, in 1394, Anne died of the plague. She was only 28. Richard was devastated. He ordered the manor where she had died to be demolished, as if he couldn't bear the reminder. He wore mourning black for the rest of his life, and he never really recovered emotionally. Of course, England didn't care about his heartbreak. They cared about the lack of heirs and his increasingly erratic rule. Within a few years, Richard was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke and imprisoned, where he likely starved to death. So their marriage? Cursed in the most tragic way. Not because of hatred or infidelity, but because it was too fragile, too unproductive, and ended in loss that pulled the king down with it. James IV of Scotland and Margaret Tudor. From England we drift north to Scotland, where James IV of Scotland married Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England in 1503. Now, this marriage was marketed like a fairy tale. The thistle and the rose, they called it, symbolizing the union of Scotland and England. Peace between the two kingdoms. A new era, except it wasn't. James IV was a relatively capable king, and Margaret was a teenager sent north as a diplomatic peace offering. They got along decently by royal standards, and they even had several children. But the political reality around them was toxic. When Margaret's brother Henry VIII took the English throne and decided to invade France in 1513, James had to choose. England was family. France was Scotland's traditional ally. In the end, James honored his French alliance and invaded England. It was a bad call. James marched straight into the Battle of Flodden, where he and much of the Scottish nobility were killed. Margaret was widowed at 23. Left with an infant son, James V, and a country in chaos. Her life after that was no less cursed. She tried to act as regent, remarried unwisely, and got caught between her English family and her Scottish subjects. Basically, her marriage had promised peace, but delivered nothing but war. Widowhood and instability. Alfonso VI of Leon and his 6 wives finally tonight. Let's drift even further back to the 11th century. Because if you think one cursed marriage is bad, try 6. Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile was a busy man. He married 6 times over his lifetime, and almost every single one of those marriages ended in tragedy. His first 2 wives both died young. His third, Constance of Burgundy, gave him a daughter but no surviving son. His 4th, Isabel, also died. His 5th, Beatrice, died within a year of marriage. His 6th, Zaida, possibly a Muslim princess who converted to Christianity, gave him a son, but the boy died young. It was like watching a medieval soap opera on repeat. Wedding bells, short-lived happiness, then funerals. Chroniclers even started to whisper that Alfonso himself was cursed. After all, how many dead wives does it take before people stop calling it bad luck? And of course, the lack of a solid male heir left his kingdom vulnerable. After his death in 1109, Leon and Castile were thrown into succession disputes and wars that dragged on for generations. So his marriages didn't just ruin his personal life, they destabilized an entire dynasty. 6 wives. 6 curses. Not exactly a great track record. Slow recap drift so. Let's lie back and take stock of where we are in this candlelit stroll through Europe's most disastrous unions. We've got Peter of Aragon dragging his wife into papal wars. Joan of France married to the bad, who then literally went up in flames. Richard II, the rare king who actually loved his wife, only to lose her young and spiral into ruin. James IV and Margaret Tudor, promising peace but delivering Flodden Field and widowhood. And Alfonso VI, who must have been the medieval equivalent of an unlucky serial dater, because none of his 6 marriages ended happily, and yet somehow, these were the people running kingdoms, which explains a lot, doesn't it? But don't close your eyes just yet, because still waiting in the shadows are more cursed stories. Child brides married to kings old enough to be their grandfathers, queens accused of poisoning their spouses, and dynasties so tangled up in cousin marriages that the priest must have had to check the family tree twice before reading the vows. So let's keep drifting. The night is long. More cursed marriages of medieval Europe. If you're still here, congratulations. You've officially outlasted more medieval brides than Alfonso VI of Leon ever managed. We've drifted past queens who died of plague, kings who got excommunicated as wedding presents, and monarchs who loved their wives so much they tore down houses in grief. But cursed marriages are the one resource Europe never seemed to run out of. Because when you mix dynastic pressure, constant wars, the Church's obsession with consanguinity, basically everyone being everyone's cousin, and the ever-present spectre of disease, you get a near-infinite supply of unhappy unions. So let's unroll Part 4 and see what fresh disasters flicker in the candlelight. Isabella of France and Edward. Thais of England. If you thought Charles the Bad was rough, wait until you meet his daughter, Isabella of France. She married Edward II of England in 1308. Now, in theory, this was a power couple. Isabella was a French princess. Edward was the King of England and a classic alliance, except Edward had other priorities. From the very start, Isabella found herself competing for her husband's attention with his favorites. The most infamous of these was Piers Gaveston, Edward's close companion, who may or may not have been his lover. Chroniclers at the time loved hinting about it, which means historians have spent centuries debating it. But whether or not it was a romance, Gaveston's influence over Edward was undeniable. Isabella was humiliated. At her own coronation banquet, Edward ignored her, sitting with Gaveston and showering him with gifts. That's not exactly the fairy tale wedding every 12-year-old princess dreams about. Eventually, the English barons rebelled, executed Gaveston, and forced Edward into a more conventional kingship. But the damage to his marriage was already done, and it didn't end there. Edward moved on to other favorites, like Hugh Despenser the Younger, who managed to be even more hated than Gaveston. Isabella was increasingly sidelined, treated more like a nuisance than a queen. By the 1320s, Isabella had had enough. She traveled to France, began an affair with Roger Mortimer, and came back to England leading a full-blown rebellion. She captured Edward, forced him to abdicate, and put her teenage son on the throne as Edward III. Edward II's death remains one of the most infamous mysteries of medieval history. Some say he was murdered at Berkeley Castle in 1327, and if you've ever heard the rumor about the red-hot poker, that's where it comes from. Whether true or not, the sheer fact that people believed his wife might have ordered such a grisly end tells you just how cursed this marriage was. So, Isabella of France married young, ignored, sidelined, publicly humiliated, and finally so furious that she toppled her own husband. Not a happy union, but certainly one for the history books. Ferdinand VI of Aragon and Germain of Foix. You probably know Ferdinand of Aragon as one half of Ferdinand and Isabella, the power couple who funded Columbus and united Spain. But after Isabella of Castile died in 1504, Ferdinand remarried. And this is where things start to get messy. His second wife was Germaine of Foix, a French princess, and their union was meant to shore up alliances against France's rivals. But Ferdinand was already in his 50s. Germaine was a teenager. That's not exactly promising, They tried for an heir, but tragedy struck almost immediately. Their first and only son was stillborn. For Ferdinand, this was catastrophic. An heir with Germain would have meant that Aragon might remain separate from Castile. Instead of eventually uniting into modern Spain under his grandson, Charles fell. In other words, one stillborn child completely altered the political map of Europe. Without him, Spain became the giant empire we know. But at the time, it just looked like Ferdinand's marriage was cursed. To make matters more awkward, Ferdinand reportedly tried taking aphrodisiacs to keep up with his much younger wife. Chroniclers claim he experimented with potions involving bulls' testicles. Whether that's true or just a smear campaign, the image of an aging king desperately chugging medieval Viagra is, well, not exactly dignified. Germaine herself went on to remarry twice after Ferdinand's death, including to a man almost 30 years younger than her. In the end, she lived a far more colourful life than the king who'd married her, but their union remains a perfect example of a cursed dynastic gamble that failed. Philip the Fair and Joan Fafron of Navarre. If you're getting the sense that Navarre was a hotbed of unfortunate marriages, you're right. Let's rewind to the 13th century and meet Joan of Navarre. She was an heiress ruling her own kingdom in her own right. When she married Philip IV of France in 1284, it seemed like a power match. Philip got control of Navarre through his wife, and Joan got the prestige of being Queen of France. But the marriage was rocky. Philip, known as Philip the Fair because of his striking looks, was, well, not fair in personality. He was cold, calculating, and obsessed with expanding royal power. Joan, meanwhile, had an independent streak. Chroniclers whispered that they were unhappy together, and some even accused her of plotting against him. The real curse, though, came for their children. Their sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, all became kings of France in quick succession. But each marriage was a disaster. The so-called Tour de Nesle affair scandal erupted when Philip and Joan's daughters-in-law were accused of adultery. Imprisoned and in some cases died under suspicious circumstances. So while Joan's own marriage was tense, it was her legacy that proved cursed. Her sons inherited the throne, but their reigns were short, childless, or riddled with scandal. Within a generation, the direct male line of the French Capetians died out, plunging France into the 100 Years' War. One marriage and centuries of chaos. That's about as cursed as it gets. Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves, and of course no discussion of cursed royal marriages would be complete without at least one stop in Tudor England. We've already brushed against Henry VIII's chaos, but let's pause on his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. This was the infamous I like her not marriage. Henry married Anne in January 1540 after seeing a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein. The marriage was political, meant to ally England with German Protestant states. But when Anne arrived in person, Henry was disappointed. We don't know exactly what he expected, but according to him, Anne didn't measure up. He called her a Flanders mare, which was both cruel and inaccurate. Most accounts say Anne was perfectly presentable, just not Henry's type. The wedding went forward, but Henry reportedly couldn't bring himself to consummate it. He complained that Anne's body smelled, and that she wasn't attractive to him. Within 6 months, the marriage was annulled. Here's the twist, though. Anne of Cleves may have been the luckiest of Henry's wives. She walked away with a generous settlement, several houses, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. She lived comfortably in England for the rest of her life, outliving all of Henry's other wives. So while the marriage itself was humiliating and short-lived, Anne probably had the last laugh. The real curse was Henry himself, a man who burned through wives like kindling, leaving behind a trail of executions, annulments, and misery. Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII of France finally tonight. Let's go back to one of the most famous queens of the Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine. She married Louis VII of France in 1137 when she was still a teenager, and he was a newly crowned king. Now Eleanor was vibrant, intelligent, and strong-willed. Louis was pious, cautious, and more suited to a monastery than a throne. They were a mismatch from the start. The most infamous episode came during the Second Crusade. Eleanor accompanied Louis to the Holy Land, but rumors quickly spread that she was too friendly with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Some said she was openly rebellious, undermining her husband's authority. The crusade itself was a disaster, and the couple returned to France estranged. Their marriage produced only 2 daughters, no sons. For a medieval royal couple, that was a flashing red light. By 1152, their union was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. Basically, they were too related, as if that ever stopped anyone else in the 12th century. Here's the curse. Just 2 months later, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become King Henry II of England. Suddenly, her vast lands of Aquitaine passed into English hands, sparking centuries of Anglo-French conflict. Louis had not only lost his wife, but accidentally supercharged his greatest rival. So yes, Louis VII's marriage to Eleanor was cursed, not because of tragedy or scandal, but because losing her changed the entire balance of European history. Slow drift recap so. Let's take a deep breath and look back at tonight's gallery of cursed couples. Isabella of France, humiliated by Edward II, who loved his favorites more than his queens, until she toppled him. Ferdinand of Aragon and Germaine of Foix, where one stillborn child changed the fate of Spain. Philip the Fair and Joan of Navarre, whose heirs imploded the Capetian dynasty in scandal. Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves, a 6-month humiliation that somehow turned into Anne's happy retirement. Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII, whose annulment set the stage for centuries of Anglo-French war. Some of these marriages ended in flames, some in annulments, some in dynastic collapse. But all of them show just how fragile and how consequential royal unions could be. A wedding might look like a glittering pageant, but beneath the gold embroidery and church bells, there was almost always a curse waiting to unfold. The most cursed marriages in medieval Europe so far. We've wandered through a hall of very unfortunate unions, kings who ignored their queens in favor of boyfriends, with terrible reputations, queens who brought no dowries and got sneered at for it, unlucky brides who died young, and husbands who decided to invade England just because their in-laws were being difficult. But there's no shortage of cursed matrimony left in medieval Europe. If anything, the deeper we go, the more we realize that the medieval royal family tree was basically a bramble bush of misery. So let's keep gliding, slow, steady, and comfortably tired, into the next set of marriages that could only be described as doomed. John of Gaunt and Constance of Castile. Let's start with a name that always sounds like it belongs in a Shakespeare play, John of Gaunt. He was the son of Edward III of England, brother of the Black Prince and father of Henry the Foughter. Basically, he was that uncle at the party who insists he would have been king if things had worked out slightly differently. In 1371, John married Constance of Castile. She was a Spanish princess with a big problem. Namely, she had a claim to the throne of Castile, which was being contested by her cousin. So naturally, John saw a chance to upgrade his resume from Duke of Lancaster to King of Castile. The marriage itself, more of a business merger than a romance. John marched off to Spain with his new wife, tried to press her claim, and promptly failed, repeatedly. His invasion was more like a very expensive camping trip that achieved nothing. Constance, meanwhile, spent her life as the political chip in John's never-ending game of, "What if I were king?" She bore him children, dutifully followed him around, and died before she ever saw her supposed throne. Cursed because they spent years chasing a crown that never came, and John of Gaunt became known more for his ambition than for any actual success. Constance got a title in England, but lost the kingdom she was promised. A marriage of frustration more than triumph. Philip II of France and Ingeborg of Denmark. If you thought Edward II and Isabella were awkward, wait until you hear about Philip II and his second wife, Ingeborg of Denmark. This is a story of instant regret on a royal scale. In 1193, Philip married Ingeborg. The ceremony went smoothly. The alliance looked promising. But literally the morning after the wedding, Philip tried to get the marriage annulled. That's right, one day in and he was already done. Why? No one knows for sure. Chroniclers give vague hints. Maybe he found her unattractive. Maybe there were political complications, or maybe he just woke up cranky. Whatever the case, he insisted the marriage wasn't valid. Ingeborg, however, refused to play along. She declared herself the true Queen of France and fought for her rights for years. She lived in virtual imprisonment, sometimes treated well, sometimes not, but always refusing to agree to the annulment. Eventually, after about 20 years of humiliation, she was recognized again as queen. By that point, the marriage was completely dead in practice, but technically they were still husband and wife. Imagine the world's longest and most awkward silent treatment. So yeah, cursed because it was doomed within hours, dragged on for decades, and made both parties miserable. Medieval France, always a good time. Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia and Joanna of Bavaria. Now let's drift eastward to Bohemia. Wenceslaus IV, son of Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire, married Joanna of Bavaria in 1370. He was 15, she was about 16, and for a little while things seemed fine, except Wenceslaus quickly developed a reputation for being lazy, fond of drink and terrible at politics. He preferred hunting and feasting to governing, which annoyed the nobles who expected a serious king. Joanna, meanwhile, was caught in the middle, watching her husband lose respect year after year. Their marriage ended suddenly in 1386, when Joanna was mauled to death by Wenceslaus's favorite hunting dogs. Yes, really, the Queen of Bohemia was torn apart by her husband's hounds. Chroniclers differ on whether it was an accident or foul play, but either way it was horrifying. Wenceslaus predictably spiraled even further after that. He remarried, but his reign never recovered. He ended up imprisoned multiple times by rebellious nobles, and his reputation as a useless king was cemented. So here's the curse. A young queen dies in a freak accident with royal dogs, and her husband becomes a historical punchline. Not exactly a marriage worth envying. Sigismund of Luxembourg and Mary of Hungary, staying in Central Europe. Let's meet Sigismund of Luxembourg, who somehow managed to become King of Hungary, King of Germany, Holy Roman Emperor, and eventually King of Bohemia. Impressive resume. But his first marriage to Mary of Hungary was less impressive. Mary was crowned King of Hungary in her own right as a child, because apparently Queen wasn't powerful enough. When she married Sigismund in 1385, it was supposed to secure his claim to her throne. Instead, it plunged Hungary into chaos. The local nobles didn't like Sigismund, and Mary herself was caught between her mother's influence and her husband's ambitions. The young couple ended up prisoners of a rival faction at one point. Mary was even forced to abdicate temporarily. Tragically, just a few years later, Mary fell from a horse while pregnant and died. Sigismund survived, inherited her kingdom and went on to become emperor, but only because his wife had cleared the path by dying young. Cursed marriage. Absolutely. For Mary it was short, humiliating, and ended in tragedy. For Sigismund, It was more like a grim stepping stone on his way to power. Margaret of Austria and John of Castile. Let's head back to Spain for a moment. Margaret of Austria, niece of Emperor Maximilian III, married John of Castile in 1497. It was supposed to unite two powerful dynasties, the Habsburgs and the Spanish Trastámaras. John was the beloved only son of Ferdinand and Isabella, basically the golden boy of Spain. Their wedding was celebrated with all the pomp and optimism of a union that would rule Europe. And then John promptly died. Within months, Margaret was left widowed at just 17. To make matters worse, she was pregnant at the time, but gave birth to a stillborn child. The entire Grand Alliance collapsed overnight. Margaret eventually remarried and went on to become a powerful regent in the Netherlands. But her first marriage was the definition of cursed. A glittering wedding, a dead husband, and a stillborn baby, all before she turned 18. The pigeonhole curse, Catherine of Aragon and Arthur Tudor. We can't talk about cursed marriages without revisiting England. Before Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, she was actually married to his older brother, Arthur Tudor. Their union in 1501 was meant to solidify an alliance between England and Spain. The wedding was huge, filled with pageantry and hopes for the future. But Arthur was sickly, and within 5 months he was dead. Catherine, suddenly a teenage widow in a foreign land, was left in limbo. Should she go back to Spain? Should she marry Henry, Arthur's younger brother? Years of negotiation followed, and in the meantime, Catherine lived in near poverty in England, waiting for her fate to be decided. Eventually, of course, she did marry Henry, and we all know how that turned out. Annulments break with Rome, multiple wives executed. But it all started with a cursed first marriage that set the stage for the Tudor soap opera. A tangent. Why were so many royal marriages cursed? Let's pause for a moment, stretch, maybe sip some water, and ask the big question. Why do these marriages keep going wrong? Part of it is just statistics. When half your brides are teenagers, disease is rampant, childbirth is deadly, and everyone's related to everyone else, things will go badly often. But there's also the political side. Royal marriages weren't about compatibility. They were about land, alliances, and producing heirs. Love wasn't just optional. It was irrelevant. As long as you had a crown and a womb, that was good enough. So when things did go wrong, when a queen didn't produce a son, or a king preferred his favorites, or an alliance backfired, the marriage wasn't just a personal failure. It was a dynastic disaster that could plunge entire kingdoms into war, which is why cursed marriages weren't just tragic stories for the individuals. They shaped history itself. Quiet drift recap. So in this round we've seen John of Gaunt and Constance of Castile, who spent their lives chasing a phantom throne. Philip II and Ingeborg of Denmark. A marriage annulled the morning after the wedding, yet dragged on for decades. Wenceslaus and Joanna of Bavaria, where the queen was killed by royal dogs. Sigismund and Mary of Hungary, where the queen died young and her husband walked off with her kingdom. Margaret of Austria and John of Castile, a teenage bride widowed within months. Catherine of Aragon and Arthur Tudor, a cursed start that led straight to the English Reformation. Each one reminds us that royal marriages weren't fairy tales. They were contracts written in blood, politics, and tragedy. And as cursed as these unions were, we still have more to go. Because medieval Europe never learned its lesson. The weddings kept happening. The curses kept coming. So let's roll softly into part 6, where we'll find even more unions that looked glittering on the surface, but collapsed into dynastic nightmares beneath the veil, when royal weddings became international diplomatic train wrecks. So, we've already floated through cursed couples who hated each other, doomed brides who died young, and kings who couldn't keep themselves together long enough to act like husbands. But medieval Europe wasn't done serving up mess, oh no, because sometimes the marriages weren't just cursed personally, they were cursed politically. Imagine centuries of diplomacy being held together by the flimsiest possible glue. A teenage wedding, a fragile alliance, and the hope that everyone involved wouldn't immediately betray each other. Spoiler, they usually did. And one of the best, or worst, depending on your level of patience, examples was the marriage between Edward II of England and Isabella of France. You might remember Edward as the king who really liked his male favorites, more than his wife. And Isabella? Well, she's often remembered as the she-wolf of France, which probably tells you everything about how this marriage turned out. Edward married Isabella in 1308, when she was about 12 years old. Because of course she was. This was a royal marriage after all. Romance wasn't the point. Political necessity was. England and France had been circling each other like cranky cats for years, and the wedding was meant to smooth things over. A sweet little symbolic gesture. Unfortunately, Edward decided to ruin the symbolism within about 5 minutes. At the wedding, instead of paying attention to his shiny new queen, Edward was doting on his other favorite, Piers Gaveston. He gave Piers all the gifts, made him the center of attention, and generally acted like the marriage was just an inconvenient side quest. Poor Isabella. She was literally still a teenager and had just married a king, and her wedding day turned into third-wheel purgatory. Her French relatives were horrified. The English nobility were horrified. Everyone was horrified except Edward and Piers, who seemed to be having the best day of their lives. It set the tone for the entire marriage, which went about as well as you'd expect, badly. Isabella bided her time, played the queenly role, and eventually launched a full-blown rebellion with her lover, Roger Mortimer. She deposed Edward. He was later murdered in captivity in one of history's more infamous episodes. You could say this wasn't a happy-ending marriage. It was more of a Game of Thrones pilot episode kind of marriage. But Edward and Isabella weren't alone in the cursed diplomatic marriage category. Let's float gently over to another political disaster. Anne of Brittany. Anne was the only child of the Duke of Brittany, and that made her the ultimate prize. Whoever married Anne basically got control of Brittany, which was a rich and strategically placed territory. The poor girl was only 12 when she was first married, by proxy no less, to Maximilian, Herr of Austria. The two had never met, but well, paperwork was signed, rings exchanged, and technically they were husband and wife. Problem solved, right? Except the French king, Charles VIII, was having none of that. He invaded Brittany, forced Anne to annul the Maximilian marriage and married her himself. So much for romance. But then Charles VIII went and died. Probably after hitting his head on a doorframe. Seriously, that's the story. Which meant Anne was once again the most eligible heiress in Europe. And the new French king Louis XV swooped in to marry her. Twice Queen of France, unwilling pawn of politics, and perpetually traded like a golden chess piece. Anne's marriages were less about love, and more about being colonized by paperwork. Now, if you're thinking, well, at least she survived unlike some of the other brides, sure. But she also spent her entire life shuttled between men who saw her less as a person and more as a strategy board. That's about as cursed as it gets, even without the tragic death subplot. And then there's the ultimate medieval soap opera, The Union of Mary, Queen of Scots and her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Okay, yes, technically this is nudging into the Renaissance, but honestly, it fits the medieval-style curse category perfectly. Mary and Darnley were both tall, good-looking, and dripping with royal blood. In fact, they were cousins because of course they were. This was the royal marriage world. If you weren't at least vaguely related, it barely counted. Everyone thought they would be a dream couple. Spoiler again, they weren't. Darnley turned out to be arrogant, violent, and jealous. He wanted the crown matrimonial, basically joint power as king, not just consort. But Mary wasn't handing it over. Their relationship spiraled into constant arguments, public humiliations, and eventually one of the most infamous murders in Scottish history. Darnley orchestrated the killing of Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, who was dragged out from Mary's presence and stabbed 56 times by a group of Darnley's friends. Romantic, right? Nothing says marital bliss like a bloody assassination dinner, but the curse didn't stop there. Darnley himself was soon murdered under suspicious circumstances when the house he was staying in literally exploded and his body was found in the garden. Let's just say this marriage wasn't built for longevity. Mary went on to marry Bothwell, who may or may not have been involved in Darnley's death, and the whole situation ended with her imprisonment and execution. A cursed royal love life if ever there was one. So, whether it was Edward and Isabella's third-wheel marriage, Anne of Brittany being the eternal pawn, or Mary and Darnley turning matrimony into a blood-soaked scandal, diplomatic marriages had a way of making everything worse. If the couple didn't hate each other, their families did. If the families didn't fight, the politics did. And if none of those cursed things happened immediately, just give it a few years, let's drift along now, because there's more waiting. The curse of medieval marriage wasn't only about politics or bad personalities. Sometimes it was about dynasties that tied themselves into such tangled knots of inbreeding that the marriages were doomed from the genetic blueprint up. And that brings us to... So we left off with Mary, Queen of Scots, and her mess of a love life. But she wasn't the only one stuck in this cursed cycle of political wedlock. Because in the medieval mindset, marriage was less about love and more about how many borders can we glue together before everything inevitably falls apart. Spoiler, the glue was always bad. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example. She's often remembered as one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages, powerful, intelligent, and stubborn. But her marriages? Cursed in their own special ways. Her first husband was Louis VII of France, who was devout, serious, and honestly, kind of boring. Their union was supposed to cement Aquitaine's ties to the French crown. Instead, it turned into a decades-long tug-of-war. Eleanor was adventurous, politically savvy, and full of ambition. Louis, on the other hand, was the kind of man who thought a fun weekend meant praying extra hard. The mismatch was spectacular. They even went on the Second Crusade together, which sounds romantic until you remember crusades were basically endless travel, bad hygiene, and men dying of heat stroke. Eleanor and Louis fought constantly during the trip. By the time they got home, the marriage was finished. It was annulled. And what did Eleanor do immediately after? She went and married Henry II of England, because why not double down? That union created the vast Angevin Empire and gave birth to future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lose-Everything Lackland. But Henry was famously unfaithful. Their marriage was full of betrayal and rebellion, and Eleanor ended up locked in captivity for years by her own husband. Another royal marriage meant to glue empires together that crumbled into power struggles and prison cells. It's almost poetic in a cursed medieval way. The bigger the political stakes, the more doomed the marriage seemed to be. Royals tied the knot to stop wars, but the knots themselves usually unraveled into new wars. It was like trying to patch a sinking ship with soggy parchment. And with that thought, let's gently drift now into the marriages that weren't just cursed by politics, or by clashing personalities, but by genetics. Because nothing says royal love quite like marrying your cousin's cousin, or in some cases, your niece. The Habsburgs are about to enter the chat. The Habsburg genetic nightmare, so. We've been gliding through political marriages that went up in flames, queens who got passed around like chess pieces, and kings who treated their wives like inconvenient furniture. But now it's time to dim the torches and wander into the part of the story that people always whisper about in history classes, the Habsburg family tree. Or maybe more accurately, the Habsburg family hedge, because it wasn't branching out, it was looping back in. The Habsburgs were one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. They ruled Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and assorted territories for centuries. But their genius strategy, or what they thought was genius, was simple. Keep it all in the family, literally. Marry cousins, marry uncles, marry nieces if you have to. Just don't let any foreign blood dilute the empire. After all, outsiders were risky. Your cousin Gertrude? You knew exactly what her dowry looked like. The problem, of course, is that human genetics doesn't care about your empire. If you keep folding the same genetic deck of cards, you don't get a royal flush. You get Charles II of Spain. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start earlier with the philosophy of Habsburg marriages. The dynasty's unofficial motto could have been, why fight a war when you can marry someone you already share a grandmother with? And it worked for a long time. The Habsburgs expanded across Europe not by bloodshed, but by, well, bloodlines. The phrase was even coined, let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. Sweet, right? Except if your family tree starts looking like a circle, the happiness tends to wear off. Take Philip the Handsome, for instance. First off, misleading name. Handsome was generous. But anyway, he married Joanna of Castile, better known as Joanna the Mad. Their marriage was passionate, intense, and disastrous. Joanna was deeply unstable, possibly suffering from severe mental illness, and Philip wasn't exactly kind, but their union laid the foundation for the Habsburg domination of Spain. Unfortunately, the genetic pool was already narrowing. Their children were married back into the same circles, cousins on cousins, nieces on uncles, and it kept spiraling. Fast forward to Emperor Maximilian II, who married his first cousin, Maria of Spain. Their children were, well, a very tightly wound group of cousins, who then went on to marry each other again. You see the pattern. By the 1600s, the family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was more like a wreath, decorative, circular, and suffocating. And all this brings us to the poster child of the Habsburg genetic experiment, Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. He's often remembered as the most inbred monarch in European history. And honestly, he didn't ask for that legacy. He was born in 1661, after generations of cousin marriages had stacked mutation on mutation like a very bleak game of Jenga. Charles was physically frail, mentally delayed, and plagued with health problems his entire life. He suffered seizures, couldn't walk properly until he was about 8, and was often described as drooling or staring blankly during official ceremonies. His contemporaries noted he had the infamous Habsburg jaw, a massive protruding lower jaw so pronounced that he couldn't chew food properly. His tongue was so large it made speech difficult. It's a tragic reminder of what happens when a dynasty decides genetics are optional. And if you're thinking, well, at least he had a healthy royal childhood to balance things out, no. His life was a parade of misfortune. He was treated like a sacred relic, too fragile to be disciplined, too important to be ignored. People whispered about whether he was cursed, bewitched, or simply divine punishment for centuries of Habsburg hubris. Honestly, the last option feels the most on brand. Charles II was married twice, both times to beautiful foreign princesses meant to secure alliances. Neither marriage produced children, which, if we're being gently snarky, was the first stroke of luck Europe had in a long time. His death in 1700 without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that reshaped Europe, all because the Habsburgs decided marrying someone who wasn't their cousin was just too radical. But Charles wasn't the only cautionary tale. The Habsburgs across Austria and Spain kept marrying in circles long after the warning signs were obvious. Jaw deformities, infertility, miscarriages, and fragile children were constant. Physicians of the time tried to come up with spiritual or moral explanations. But really, the explanation was sitting right there in the family Bible. You can't keep marrying your cousin named Maria and expect the universe to reward you with sturdy children. The irony is, while the Habsburgs were convinced they were protecting their empire, they were slowly hollowing it out from the inside. Their genetic decline mirrored their political decline. By the time outsiders were finally marrying into the line again, the damage was already done. And yet, despite all this, the dynasty persisted for centuries. Because power, wealth, and the ability to commission flattering portraits can paper over a lot. Even if those portraits occasionally show a monarch who looked less like God's anointed and more like a slightly melted wax figure. So in the end, the Habsburg genetic nightmare wasn't just about Charles II or one unlucky jawline. It was about the way an entire ruling family prioritized control and fear of outsiders over basic biology. And the result was a dynasty that produced some of the most cursed marriages Europe had ever seen. Let's float now gently, away from Spain's poor Charles and his doomed jawline. Because as tragic, and a little darkly comedic, and as the Habsburgs were, they weren't the only family turning marriage into a slow-motion disaster. There were plenty of other royal houses where things went off the rails, which brings us next to the Plantagenets and their delightful tradition of destroying themselves through marriage. And yet, despite all this, the dynasty persisted for centuries. Because power, wealth, and the ability to commission flattering portraits can paper over a lot. Even if those portraits occasionally show a monarch who looked less like God's anointed and more like a slightly melted wax figure. So in the end, the Habsburg genetic nightmare wasn't just about Charles II or one unlucky jawline. It was about the way an entire ruling family prioritized control and fear of outsiders over basic biology. And the result was a dynasty that produced some of the most cursed marriages Europe had ever seen. Let's float now gently, away from Spain's poor Charles and his doomed jawline. Because as tragic, and a little darkly comedic, and as the Habsburgs were, they weren't the only family turning marriage into a slow-motion disaster. There were plenty of other royal houses where things went off the rails, which brings us next to the Plantagenets and their delightful tradition of destroying themselves through marriage. Plantagenet marriages gone wrong, so we just floated past the Habsburgs and their circular family tree. But if you were thinking the English royal line, the Plantagenets, were doing any better, well, no. These were the people who turned marriage into both a weapon and a battlefield, and unlike the Habsburgs, who destroyed themselves slowly with genetics, the Plantagenets liked to speed things up with messy divorces, betrayals, rebellions, and the occasional bloody coup. A cursed family in their own special way. Let's start with one of the most famous, Edward II and Isabella of France. Yes, we already mentioned them briefly in the political train wreck section, but honestly, this marriage deserves an encore. Isabella was supposed to be a diplomatic bridge between England and France. Instead, she got stuck with Edward, who lavished all his affection on his male favourites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser. Isabella, meanwhile, was left publicly humiliated and politically sidelined. Eventually, she got tired of being ignored, so she staged one of the most audacious glow-ups in medieval history. She crossed the Channel, took a lover, Roger Mortimer, raised an army and stormed back into England. The result? Edward II was overthrown, imprisoned, and allegedly killed in one of history's more colourful, and possibly apocryphal ways. If you've heard the red-hot poker story, yeah, that's the one. A marriage that began as a treaty, ended as a true crime podcast episode. But Edward and Isabella weren't alone in turning matrimony into battlefield chaos. Let's float over to Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now Eleanor was already a legend. She'd been married to Louis X of France, dumped him after the world's least compatible relationship, and then immediately married Henry, who was younger, ambitious and very much her equal in cunning. Sounds like a power couple, right? Well, yes, but in the worst possible way. Their marriage produced a brood of children who would become infamous in their own right. Richard the Lionheart, King John, Geoffrey, and more. But instead of being proud parents, Henry and Eleanor spent most of their time undermining each other. Henry was perpetually unfaithful, fathering children with mistresses left and right, while Eleanor eventually sided with her own sons in a rebellion against him. Imagine being married so badly that you encourage your children to go to war against their father. That's not a marriage. That's a medieval Jerry Springer episode. And speaking of King John, let's not skip him. John is remembered mostly for losing Normandy, being forced to sign Magna Carta, and generally tanking the Plantagenet reputation. But his marriages didn't exactly help. His first marriage to Isabella of Gloucester was annulled because she was politically inconvenient. His second, to Isabella of Angoulême, caused a full-blown international scandal. Why? Because Isabella was already betrothed to a French nobleman. John basically swooped in, stole the bride, and married her himself. Predictably, the French were furious. The result? War. Because of course it was. Then there's Richard II, who married not once but twice in arrangements that were meant to stabilize his shaky reign. First, he wed Anne of Bohemia, a surprisingly peaceful union by medieval standards, but tragically short. She died young, and Richard was devastated, which is about as close to a tender love story as this family got. His second marriage, though, to Isabella of Valois, was a political alliance that went nowhere. She was only 6 years old when they married, not exactly soulmate, material, and the whole thing collapsed along with Richard's, drained the Plantagenets treated marriage less like a sacred union and more like a board game. Each move was about grabbing land, consolidating alliances or humiliating rivals. But the curse was that none of it ever worked for long. The alliances broke down, the heirs fought each other, and eventually the dynasty imploded in the Wars of the Roses. Basically, generations of cursed marriages led directly to cousins killing cousins for the crown. And here's the real irony. For all the plotting and scheming, the Plantagenets ended up being replaced by a family even messier, the Tudors. Which just goes to show, no matter how cursed you think your marriage is, there's always someone coming along to make it look tame. Let's drift now into that next storm of dysfunction. Because if you thought the Plantagenets were chaotic, just wait until we tuck ourselves in with the Tudors, where cursed marriages weren't just common, they were practically the family brand. So we ended with the Plantagenets essentially collapsing under the weight of their own bad choices. But the thing about the Plantagenets is, their cursed marriages didn't just ruin their own generation. They planted the seeds for centuries of fallout. Take the Wars of the Roses, for example. This whole dynastic civil war was, at its root, a family feud sparked by, you guessed it, disastrous marriages and questionable heirs. When Richard II died without children, his crown passed to a cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. That didn't sit well with all the other branches of the family tree, who were like, "Excuse me, what about my claim?" Cue decades of cousin-on-cousin warfare, made even messier by the fact that everyone's great-grandmother was basically the same person. Then we get to Henry VI, one of the most tragic Plantagenet kings. He was gentle, pious, and absolutely unsuited for the job of ruling England during one of its most turbulent periods. His marriage to Margaret of Anjou was meant to shore up his shaky position. Instead, it poured gasoline on the fire. Margaret was fierce, ambitious, and determined to defend her husband's claim, while Henry himself had mental breakdowns so severe he once failed to recognize his own newborn son. Not exactly stable royal parenting. Their marriage, instead of stabilizing the crown, helped spark decades of bloody civil war. And here's where it gets even darker. Margaret and Henry's only son, Edward of Westminster, grew up in the middle of this chaos. He was betrothed to Anne Neville, a marriage meant to glue together alliances again. But Edward was killed in battle as a teenager, leaving Margaret shattered and the dynasty weakened beyond repair. The Plantagenets had played their marriage game one too many times, and by the late 1400s, the line was running out of viable heirs, which leads us, inevitably, to Richard III, the last Plantagenet king. His own marriage to Anne Neville, yes, the same Anne who had been betrothed to the dead Edward of Westminster, was overshadowed by suspicion and scandal. People whispered that Richard had killed his nephews, the princes in the Tower, to secure his throne. Anne died young, possibly of illness, possibly from the sheer exhaustion of being married into one of the most cursed dynasties in Europe. Richard himself didn't last long either. He was killed at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, his crown literally knocked off his head in the mud. And that was it. The Plantagenets were done. Centuries of political marriages, cousin alliances, betrayals, annulments, and disasters had ended in total collapse. Their cursed unions hadn't built an unshakable dynasty. They'd set up one long domino line that eventually tipped over and crashed. The Tudors, of course, swooped in after Bosworth and took the throne. But let's not pretend they were an upgrade. If the Plantagenets turned marriage into civil war, the Tudors turned marriage into a national soap opera. Divorce, beheadings, annulments, repeat. At least the Plantagenets tried to pretend marriage was about strategy. The Tudors, they made it personal. So with the Plantagenets buried, sometimes literally under parking lots, let's drift into the Tudor bedrooms, where cursed marriages weren't accidents of politics, but carefully orchestrated disasters. The Tudors and their six-wife catastrophe. So the Plantagenets collapsed in a pile of cousin drama, battlefield betrayals, and dynastic implosions. Out of that chaos rose a new family, the Tudors. And if the Plantagenets were cursed by accident, the Tudors were cursed by design. Because the Tudors didn't just use marriage for politics, they turned marriage into their brand. And at the center of it all, of course, is one man, Henry VIII, the king who made 6 wives into a history-class punchline. Let's set the scene. Henry wasn't even supposed to be king. He was the second son, destined for a life in the church while his older brother Arthur was groomed to rule. But fate had other plans. Arthur died young, leaving behind his widow, Catherine of Aragon. Yes, that Catherine. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the power couple who had just kicked the Moors out of Granada and funded Christopher Columbus. She was royal, Catholic, and prestigious. England was lucky to have her, but Catherine's marriage prospects hit a snag when Arthur died. She was widowed at 16, living in England, and politically stranded. The solution? Marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry. Yes, this was technically against church law, but Catherine swore she and Arthur had never consummated the marriage. Insert your own medieval awkwardness here. The Pope gave the green light and boom, Catherine married Henry, who by then had become king. At first it seemed promising. Catherine was smart, cultured, and genuinely devoted to Henry. But the curse of the Tudors quickly made itself known. Catherine had multiple pregnancies, most of which ended in stillbirths or infant deaths. The only surviving child was Mary Tudor, later known as Bloody Mary. Henry, obsessed with having a male heir, grew frustrated and eventually convinced himself that the marriage was cursed by God because he had married his brother's widow. Convenient logic, right? Enter Anne Boleyn. Anne was young, witty, fashionable, and very, very good at saying no until she got what she wanted. Henry became infatuated, and soon the great matter began. That's historian speak for Henry spending years trying to divorce Catherine. The Pope refused. Europe rolled its eyes, and Henry decided, fine, I'll just break up with the Catholic Church entirely. Thus the Church of England was born. Catherine was shoved aside, exiled from court, and left to die lonely. And Anne? Well, she got the crown. Briefly, because Anne's fate was just as cursed. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but no sons. Henry's obsession with heirs never cooled, and his eyes started wandering again. Anne's sharp tongue and fiery temper didn't help. Eventually, she was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges that were, let's be honest, probably cooked up for convenience. In 1536, Anne was executed at the Tower of London. Her marriage ended not with divorce, but with a sword. Romantic dot, next came Jane Seymour. Henry's third wife was gentle, obedient, and basically everything Anne wasn't. Henry adored her, or at least as much as he was capable of adoring anyone. And Jane succeeded where the others had failed. She gave birth to a son, the future Edward VI. Unfortunately, Jane died from postnatal complications just days later. Henry considered her his true wife, but let's not get misty-eyed. She barely survived the honeymoon phase. Now at this point, Henry was middle-aged, overweight, and increasingly cranky. But he wasn't done. Enter Anne of Cleves. This marriage was arranged sight unseen through political negotiations with German princes. Henry was sent a flattering portrait of Anne by the artist Hans Holbein, and based on that he agreed. When they finally met in person, Henry infamously declared he found her nothing fair. Translation, she wasn't his type. The marriage was annulled after 6 months, and Anne lived out her days as Henry's beloved sister, a polite way of saying royal ex with benefits. Then came Catherine Howard, who was young enough to be Henry's granddaughter. She was lively, flirtatious, and disastrously naive. Predictably, rumors of her affairs spread, and unlike Anne Boleyn, these rumors were probably true. Henry was humiliated. Catherine was executed in 1542, at the age of about 20. Another wife down, another tragedy chalked up to the curse. Finally, we arrive at Catherine Parr, wife number 6. Catherine was intelligent, pragmatic, and twice widowed already. She acted more like a nurse than a bride, tending to Henry's gout and ulcers. Remarkably, she survived him. After Henry's death in 1547, she even remarried again. Proof that not every Tudor marriage ended with blood on the floor, so there you have it. 6 wives, 6 disasters, and one man who somehow thought he was cursed by God instead of cursed by his own ego. But the real kicker is that Henry's obsession with heirs didn't even pay off. His son Edward VI died young, his daughter Mary reigned briefly and disastrously, and it was Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, who ended up being the most successful Tudor monarch. The woman Henry dismissed as a disappointment became Gloriana. Irony doesn't get much sweeter, and if you thought the curse of Tudor marriages ended with Henry, oh no. His children carried on the tradition in their own messy ways. Mary married Philip II of Spain, which went about as well as you'd expect. He wasn't interested, she was miserable, and England hated the match. Elizabeth famously never married at all. Perhaps she looked at her father's track record and thought, you know what? No thanks. So the Tudors may have reigned for just over a century, but they packed more cursed marital energy into those years than most dynasties manage in half a millennium. From broken alliances to decapitated brides, their marital history wasn't just unlucky, it was catastrophic. And yet somehow through all the chaos, the Tudors remained the most glamorous dynasty in English memory, which just goes to show, if you add enough drama, tragedy and scandal, people will remember you fondly anyway. Now, let's float gently out of Henry's disastrous wedding chapel and into yet another cursed set of unions. Because while England was busy chopping off heads, France was brewing its own marital disasters, complete with poisoned brides, scheming queens and dynasties falling apart in spectacular fashion. And so, with the Tudors' bloody wedding bells finally silenced, our story drifts across the Channel into France, where things were, if possible, even messier. Because if Henry VIII made marriage a battlefield, the French Valois dynasty turned it into a full-scale war. The Valois court in the 1500s was a glittering carnival of silk, jewels, and masked dances. But beneath all that velvet was poison, daggers, and whispered betrayal. French marriages weren't just about heirs. They were about controlling entire regions of Europe. Every bride was a pawn, every groom a hostage to diplomacy, and every wedding banquet came with the possibility of death by wine goblet. Take Catherine de' Medici, for instance. She came from Florence, married into the French crown, and brought with her a reputation for poison, astrology, and ruthless cunning. For decades, she manipulated the marriages of her children like a spider tugging at a web. Her daughters and sons became bargaining chips in a Europe torn between Catholic and Protestant. And their weddings often ended not in happiness, but in bloodbaths like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands were slaughtered in the name of religious unity, all sparked around a marriage celebration. If the Tudors were cursed by Henry's obsession with sons, the Valois were cursed by their own fragility. So many of their marriages produced sickly, short-lived heirs that it seemed like France itself was running out of kings. The dynasty eventually collapsed under the weight of its own unlucky unions, leaving the throne wide open for the Bourbons. So yes, the Tudors had 6 wives and beheadings, but the French Valois? They had poisoned chalices, assassinations, and weddings that triggered civil wars. The Valois marriages and French royal disasters. So we've left England's Tudor circus behind, with its revolving door of wives and heads on spikes, and now we float into France. If the Tudors were loud, bloody, and scandalous, the French Valois dynasty was, well, more subtle in its disaster. Think less public execution, and more accidental poisoning at a wedding feast. Same energy, different aesthetics. The Valois had ruled France for centuries, but by the 1500s, their dynasty was wobbling on legs as shaky as a 3-legged stool. They were running out of heirs, running out of stable marriages, and, as if that weren't enough, running smack into the Protestant Reformation, which meant every royal marriage wasn't just a union of 2 people. It was a ticking religious time bomb. Let's start with King Henry II of France. Now on paper, Henry looked like a solid monarch. He had the throne, he had the armies, and most importantly, he had a politically powerful wife, Catherine de' Medici. Catherine wasn't just any Italian noblewoman. She was a Medici, the bankers, the patrons of art, the people who basically owned Florence. A Medici marriage meant money, prestige, and the faint smell of Renaissance poison recipes. But here's the problem. Henry II was madly in love with another woman. Ganta Diane de Poitiers, his mistress, who was 20 years older than him. Yes, 20. Catherine was sidelined from day one, treated more like a useful broodmare than a partner. And yet Catherine produced 10 children. 10, that's stamina. Unfortunately, Most of them grew up to be either sickly, unstable, or dead within a decade of ruling, which is very on-brand for a cursed dynasty. Now Henry II himself met a gloriously stupid end. During a jousting match, because of course kings loved pretending they were medieval knights even in the Renaissance, a splintered lance pierced his eye. Infection set in and boom, France had a dead king, a widow with too much ambition and a brood of half-baked heirs waiting in line. Catherine de' Medici was suddenly in charge. And oh, did she take charge. Catherine became queen regent for her sons, and basically ran the French court like a chessboard. She arranged marriages for her children not out of love, but out of cold calculation. But the problem was those marriages just kept blowing up. Take her daughter Margaret of Valois, better known as Queen Margot. Catherine married her off to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, in an attempt to heal France's religious divide. The wedding, held in Paris in 1572, was supposed to be a grand display of unity. Instead, it became the trigger for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, one of the most infamous bloodbaths in French history. Thousands of Protestants who had come to Paris for the wedding were slaughtered in the streets. Imagine planning a wedding and accidentally starting a genocide. That's Valois marriage planning in a nutshell, and poor Queen Margot herself. She and Henry of Navarre basically hated each other from the moment the ink dried on the marriage contract. She spent most of her life estranged from him, bouncing between prisons and scandals, while Henry eventually became Henry IV of France after the Valois line collapsed. Catherine had hoped the marriage would save her dynasty. Instead, it ended it. Meanwhile, Catherine's sons didn't fare much better. Francis II, married off to Mary, Queen of Scots, died as a teenager. His marriage left behind no heirs, but did tie France into Scotland's eternal political soap opera. Then came Charles IX, who had a nervous breakdown, paranoid fits, and may have personally joined in the St. Bartholomew's Day slaughter, not exactly a healthy marriage partner. He died young, leaving behind only one legitimate daughter. And then there was Henry III, Catherine's last surviving son, who married Louise of Lorraine. Their marriage was childless, partly because Henry was more interested in his court favorites, the infamous Mignon, than his queen. By the time Henry III was assassinated in 1589, the Valois line was out of gas. Centuries of strategic marriages, cousin breeding, and religiously explosive weddings had left France with no male heir. The dynasty literally married itself into extinction. The irony, of course, is that all of Catherine's desperate matchmaking, all those marriages she arranged, all the political deals sealed with kisses and rings, only managed to erase her dynasty from history. The throne passed to the Bourbons, with her son-in-law Henry of Navarre becoming Henry IV. Catherine had tried to control the future of France through weddings, but in the end, her dynasty vanished in a puff of poisoned incense. So, compared to the Tudors, the Valois were less flashy but maybe even more cursed. Where Henry VIII chopped off wives' heads, Catherine de' Medici arranged marriages that blew up into massacres. Different strategies, same tragic outcome, a dynasty in ruins. Now let's float away from France's poisoned goblets and religious wedding feasts and drift eastward. Because while the Tudors and the Valois were busy imploding, the Habsburgs were quietly perfecting the art of marital self-destruction. And by self-destruction, I mean marrying their cousins until their entire family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot of spaghetti. The Habsburg genetic spiral. So here we are, leaving behind Catherine de' Medici's poison cabinet and the Valois' extinction, and floating east into the lands of the Habsburgs. If the Tudors were a circus, and the Valois a masquerade, the Habsburgs were, let's just say, a family that didn't believe in outside hires. They ran Europe like a medieval HR department, where the only acceptable candidates were already sitting at the family dinner table. For centuries, the Habsburgs clung to one strategy: marry, don't fight. They even had a smug little rhyme about it in Latin: Bella geranta li tu Felix Austria nube, or let others wage war. You happy Austria marry, cute slogan, except when your version of marriage basically meant your niece. The Habsburgs understood that land, crowns and influence could all be acquired much faster by exchanging wedding rings than by sending armies. So they married into Spain, into Burgundy, into Hungary, into Bohemia, and when they ran out of external partners, they started doubling back on themselves, over and over, like a dynastic echo chamber, which brings us to the infamous Habsburg jaw. If you've ever seen a portrait of a late Habsburg monarch and thought, why does he look like a clay figurine left too long in the sun? That's the family resemblance. Generations of intermarriage had produced a distinct look: protruding lower lips, oversized jaws, and faces that could only politely be described as unfortunate. But the genetic spiral wasn't just about looks. It came with all sorts of charming bonuses: epilepsy, infertility, developmental issues, and kings who could barely rule because their bodies were collapsing under centuries of cousin marriage. Which brings us inevitably to the most tragic poster child of them all, Charles II of Spain. Charles II, born in 1661, was the product of more than 200 years of relentless Habsburg inbreeding. His parents were uncle and niece, which sounds bad enough, but by the time Charles came along, his family tree was so twisted that he had fewer distinct ancestors than most people's great-grandparents. Basically, his DNA was a recycling bin. The results were noticeable. Charles was described as weak, sickly, and barely able to chew food properly, thanks to that trademark jaw. He didn't learn to walk until he was about 4 years old, and he couldn't speak clearly until 8. His health problems made him a permanent medical case study for the Spanish court, and yet he was king. The Habsburg strategy had finally produced a monarch so fragile that he seemed like a parody of their entire dynasty. Of course, marriages were still on the table, because nothing says solution like marrying off the sickly king to another relative. Charles married twice, first to a French princess and then to a German one. Neither marriage produced children, which was less a surprise and more an inevitability. His infertility was practically written into the family DNA at that point. His wives often complained that he was more like a child than a husband, which, well, they weren't wrong. Charles spent his life surrounded by doctors, priests, and advisors, desperately trying to keep him alive long enough to produce an heir. But when he died in 1700 at the age of 38, childless and broken, the entire Spanish Habsburg line collapsed with him. 2 centuries of strategic marriages had ended not in triumph but in extinction, and the fallout was enormous. Charles II's death without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the biggest conflicts in early modern Europe. So yes, the Habsburg marriage policy didn't just ruin their own family. It dragged the rest of the continent into chaos too. The Habsburgs are the ultimate case study in why marrying your cousins for too many generations is a bad idea. Their motto might as well have been, why expand the gene pool when you can just reuse the same bucket of water? And yet, for all their genetic disasters, the Habsburgs clung to power for centuries. They ruled Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and much of Central Europe. Their marriages bought them an empire, even if their children were paying the price. So, after centuries of carefully orchestrated weddings, we're left with a dynasty that perfected the art of the cursed marriage, a family that literally bred itself into oblivion. Now, let's gently drift away from the collapsing Habsburg jaw and look elsewhere in Europe. because they weren't the only ones with cursed weddings. Over in Russia, the Romanovs were mixing political marriages with mysticism, assassinations, and a little too much reliance.